Welcome back to the Simulator series. In today's episode, we are going to be setting up the trading list. So, hopping directly into Studio, let's go ahead and start off by creating the trade list GUI. In order to do this, we're going to go inside of the starter GUI, and we're actually going to go ahead and duplicate our settings GUI because it's built pretty similarly to how we plan on building this GUI. So we're going to rename this to be called Trade, and then we're going to go ahead and enable it. Inside of here, we have a frame, and we're actually going to rename this to be called List. This GUI is going to behave a little bit differently than our other GUIs. Inside of the screen GUI, we're going to have a couple of frames. We're going to have the list frame, which is going to display all the players in our game that we're able to trade with. Additionally, we're going to have a notification frame, which is the frame that will become visible whenever a player receives a trade request. And then we're also going to have a trade frame, which is going to be displayed when two players have agreed to trade. That's going to display all the pets that they're able to give to the other player and go through the standard trading process. And again, we're creating all of those as different frames rather than creating them as individual screen GUIs. Now in this episode, we're only going to be creating the list frame as well as the notification frame, and then we'll make the final trade frame in the next episode. Anyways, with all that being laid out, let's go ahead and start modifying the list frame. So inside of the list frame, we had the title text label, and we're going to replace the word settings with trade. Then we have the container, and inside of here, we have a template. Let's go ahead and make that visible. Now that we can see the template, what I'm going to do is go ahead and set the background transparency to 0 so that we can actually see the background. I'm also going to update the color as well to this nice little blue right there. Then inside of the template, we have a UI list layout, which we're actually going to delete. After that, we have a text label called setting, which we're going to rename to be called player. And then let's go ahead and update the text of this. And I'm going to go ahead and use my username, so monsterdev. In addition to that, I'm going to modify the font and I'm going to make this bold. Now we also have a toggle text button in here, which we're actually going to go ahead and delete. Now that we've deleted that, let's go ahead and vertically center the player text label. So we're going to say 0.5 for the anchor point and then 0.5 on the Y. Then let's go ahead and move this over to the left side of the frame. So we're going to set this to about 0.025 on the X scale. And now it's over towards the left-hand side of the screen. Another important thing is that we want to make sure that the text X alignment is left because it would look a little bit odd being centered or right. Now that we're finished with the player text label, we're going to go ahead and duplicate it, and then we'll rename this to be called action. After that, we're going to modify the text to say sent, and now we want to move this towards the right of the frame. So we're going to set the X scale to about 675. And we're also going to change the size as well because we do not need it to be that large. We'll also adjust the text X alignment and set that to right. And now we're almost finished with this template. One of the last things that we want to do is go ahead and throw a UI corner inside of here. And we're going to go ahead and set the corner radius to 0.1 on the scale. Now that we're finished creating the template, let's go ahead and modify the UI grid layout a little bit because on the X scale, we want to make it a little bit smaller. So we're going to set that to 0.925. And we also want to make it a little bit less tall as well. So we're going to set the Y to 0.15. Then let's scroll down a little bit and adjust the horizontal alignment and set that to center. And now that we've done that, this template is looking really good. Let's go ahead and duplicate it a couple of times and see how they appear. And I'm liking that, but maybe let's just add a tiny bit more of space to them. So we'll set the cell padding Y scale to 0.015. Then I'm going to go ahead and delete all of the templates except for one. Now, there's one more quick thing that we need to do with the template, and we actually have to swap this template out from being a frame to being a button because we want our players to be able to actually click on this. So in order to do that, we're just going to go ahead and add a text button inside of here, and we'll go ahead and rename it to be called template. Then we'll go ahead and copy some properties. So we're going to go ahead and copy the background color. And that's really actually all that we have to copy. In addition to that, we want to go ahead and set the text property of this to blank. And then let's just go ahead and drag in all of the children from the template frame into the template text button. We can then go ahead and delete the template frame. And now we have our text button that players can click whenever they want to send a trade request to another player. Now, the next thing that we want to do is actually shrink the container a tiny bit because we don't want it to be as tall. So we're just going to drag this up a little bit. And the reason that we don't want it to be as tall is because we actually want to add a text button below the container, which the player can click on to toggle if they would like to receive trade requests or not. So for the actual size of the request button, on the X scale, we're going to set that to 0.7. And on the Y scale, we're going to set that to 0.1. Now let's go ahead and readjust this a little bit. And of course, let's go ahead and manually adjust the positions. So for the X of the anchor point, we're going to set that to 0.5. And for the position on the X scale, we're going to set that to 0.5 as well so that we center it horizontally. Let's then go ahead and update the background color. And we want to make this a slightly darker green. Now that we've done that, the text label is really annoying me. Let's go ahead and recenter this. And boom, there we go. In addition to repositioning it, let's also resize it a tiny bit. And I'm going to go with 0.85 on both the X and the Y. And then we're just going to go ahead and tweak the position one more time because I like to be a little precise. And we're going to change the Y scale from 0.877 to 0.875 to move it up just a tiny bit. Additionally, I'd recommend selecting your container so that you can make sure that the request button is outside of the container frame. And if it is, then you're all good to go. Now, with all that being said, we are actually good to go with the list frame. So what we're going to do is go ahead and duplicate this. And then we're going to rename this to be called notification. Additionally, we will make the list frame no longer visible so that we can start working on the notification frame. Now, going inside of the notification frame, we have the title text label. We're going to go ahead and adjust the text of this to say trade request. Then what we're going to do is resize this. So on the X scale, I'm going to go with about 0.12, and then on the Y scale, I'm going to go with about 0.125. For the position of this, we want this to appear towards the top of our screen. So we're going to set the Y scale to 0.025, just so that there's a little bit of space between it and the top of the screen. Now, going inside of the notification frame, we have a scrolling frame, which we're actually going to go ahead and delete. Additionally, we have an exit text button, which we're going to delete as well. And now, looking at our title text label, we're going to go ahead and readjust its sizing a little bit. So on the X scale, we're going to go with 0.65, and on the Y scale, we're going to go with 0.245. So we made it a little bit larger. Let's also adjust its positioning as well. So on the Y scale, we're just going to set that to 0.1 to give it a little bit of space from the top. Next, what we're going to do is duplicate this text label and rename it to be called from. We'll then adjust the text to this to say from, and then some username. So we'll go ahead and use my username. Then let's go ahead and reposition this a little bit. And we want to center this both horizontally and vertically. So let's go ahead and update the anchor point as well as the position. We're also going to adjust the size a little bit. So we'll update the Y scale from 0.245 down to 0.15 to certainly make it smaller than the title. So now that we've gotten both those text labels created, the next thing we need to do is create our two response buttons, which are going to be deny or accept. Now, to make this a little bit easier, what we're going to do is go ahead and create a frame. And we're going to rename this to be called buttons. Then let's of course make sure that we set the size to scale. And then we're going to bring this down a little bit and we'll resize this as well to where we actually plan to display the buttons. So for the precise sizing of this, we're going to go with 0.875 on the X and 0.2 on the Y. Of course, for the positioning, we want to center this horizontally. So we'll set those X's to 0.5. And then for the Y, we're going to raise this a tiny bit. So we're going to set that to 0.705. Now that we've created this frame, let's go ahead and actually drag the request button inside of here. And then we're going to add a UI list layout inside of the buttons frame. Now let's go ahead and resize the request button a little bit. So on the X scale, we're going to set that to 0.4. While on the Y scale, we're going to set that to 1 because we want it to stretch the entire height. Then we'll go ahead and rename this button to be called accept. And inside of here, we'll go ahead and update the text of the title text label to say accept. And one of the last things that we want to do to this button is update the UI corner, and we'll update the corner radius from about 0.1 to maybe 0.25. Depends on how round you want it, but I think that's looking pretty good. Now that we've created this button, let's go ahead and duplicate it. We'll change the background color from that nice green over to this bright red, and we'll go ahead and rename the text button to be called ignore. Then, of course, we had the title. Let's go ahead and update the text of this to say ignore. And now we've created both of our buttons. Let's go ahead and modify the UI list layout to change how these are being laid out. We'll change the fill direction from vertical to horizontal. We'll then change the horizontal alignment to center and the vertical alignment to center as well, although that doesn't really matter here. And now for the padding, let's go ahead and set that to 0.05. And now I think both those buttons are looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and adjust the background transparency of the buttons frame to 1 so that we no longer see the white background. And we now have our notification frame pretty much fully set up. One quick tip, if you want to change the order in which the accept or ignore buttons are appearing, all you have to do is update the layout order property of either of them or both of them. So by default, both of their layout orders are set to 0. And currently in our game, the accept button is appearing before the ignore button. But if we would like to swap their positions, we can change the layout order property of accept to 1, which would make this button appear after ignore. So now it's appearing on the right side rather than the left. Anyways, like I said, we are done with creating the notification frame. So let's go ahead and set the visibility of that to false as well. And now with both of those GUIs being created, I think we're ready to start scripting. Now, in order to start scripting this, we're actually going to go ahead and update the player's data. The reason that we're going to update the player's data is because we want to allow the player to toggle if they would like to receive trade requests or not. So in order to do this, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the player data folder, and open up the template module script. Inside of here, we will scroll all the way down. After the leaderboard rewards, we're going to go ahead and add the receive trade request key. And by default, we're going to set that to true because we want the players to be able to receive trade requests by default, even the first time that they join the game. After we've done that, we can go ahead and close out of the template module script. And next, what we're going to do is go ahead and create our remote events. So we'll go inside of the remotes folder, and we're actually going to go ahead and create a folder inside of here, which we'll rename to be called trade. Then inside of here, we'll go ahead and create a remote event. Now we're going to rename this remote event to be called toggle requests. And we're going to use this remote event whenever the player toggles if they would like to receive trade requests or not. So that's how we're going to communicate from the client to the server. Hey, we no longer want to accept trade requests. And then from the server, we'll update their player data, which of course will in turn update the state manager to keep that data in sync with the client. And now the whole reason that I'm saying that is because after we create these remote events, we're going to go ahead and update the state manager. So that's why I'm trying to make the connection now to hopefully make it easier to follow and understand. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and duplicate this remote event, and we'll rename this one to be called send request. This remote event is going to be fired off from the client to tell the server that we want to send a request to a specific player. We can go ahead and duplicate the remote event once again, and we'll rename this one to be called respond to request. This remote event is going to be used whenever the player clicks on a button inside of the notification frame, so either they ignore or they accept the trade request. And we'll have another remote event, which is going to be called receive request, which will fire from the server to the player when they receive a trade request from another player. And finally, we'll create one more remote event, which is going to be called start. Now, this remote event is going to be used for when the trading between the two players actually begins, because somebody's trade request has been accepted. And again, we're not going to really go too far into setting that whole thing up. We're just going to get to the point of where we actually fire this remote event off, and then we're going to stop there for this episode. Anyways, with all those remotes being added, let's go ahead and minimize all those folders. And then let's go ahead and update the client state manager. So we're going to go inside of the client folder and open up the state module script. Down towards the very bottom of the script, what we're going to do is copy the last remote event connection. Now remember, we just created a folder inside of the remotes folder, so we have to say .trade. And do you remember what specific remote event that we're actually going to use because we need to update some state on the client? Well, that was the toggle request remote event. Now, when we use this remote event, we're going to receive a value, which is going to be a Boolean. So it'll either be true or false, depending on what we're now toggling request to. So rather than indexing the player data with current world, we of course want to index that with receive trade requests, and then we're going to set it to the brand new value. Perfect. Now we're keeping the client updated whenever the player toggles if they want to receive trade requests or not. So we can go ahead and close out of that module script and collapse the client folder. So now that we've done all that, the next thing that we're going to do is start scripting the different GUIs that we just created on the client side. So we're going to go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, inside of the GUI folder, and we're going to create a brand new folder, which is going to be called trade. Then inside of here, we're going to go ahead and create a local script, which we'll rename to be called list. Now inside of here, we're going to want to go ahead and create a couple of variables. So we're going to want to go ahead and get the players as well as the replicated storage service. We'll then create a variable for the local player as well as the player GUI folder, then a variable for the remotes folder, which is set to .remotes, and then we go inside of that with the trade folder. Then we require the state manager module script, and then we create a variable for the button GUI, which is called left, and that's stored inside of the player GUI. The reason that we need to require the button GUI is because we need to create a variable for the open button, because remember, we had that trade button displayed on the left of our screen. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called open button. Inside of the button GUI, we have a frame, and inside of the frame, we have another frame called buttons, and inside of that frame, we have an image button called trade. In addition to getting that GUI, we also need to get the trade GUI that we just created. So let's go ahead and create a variable called trade, which is going to be equal to player GUI, wait for child, and then we're going to wait for the trade screen GUI. Then let's go ahead and create a variable for the notification frame. And inside of the notification frame, we have the buttons frame, which of course contains the accept and the ignore button. So that's why we're going to go ahead and create a variable for that frame, which contains the two buttons. Along with the notification frame, we want to create a variable for the list frame, which is stored inside of the GUI. Now inside of the list frame, we have the container. So we'll create a variable for that. Inside of the list frame, we also have the request toggle button. So let's go ahead and create a variable for that. And then we also have the exit button. So let's go ahead and create a variable for that. All right, first things first, let's go ahead and script the open button. So we're going to say open button.mouse button one click, connect, create an anonymous function inside of there. And what are we going to do when the button is clicked? Well, we're going to set the visibility of the list frame to the opposite of what it currently is. So we can make it visible or not visible, both by just clicking on this button. Then we're going to go ahead, copy and paste that, because we're going to go ahead and script the exit button. And we could pretty much just leave it as is, but I'm just going to set this to false because that's really what we intend for it to do. Now, the first thing I want to do inside of here is create a function which we're going to use to populate our container frame with all the different templates. And remember, we're going to have one template for every player that's in our game. But another thing that we need to make sure of is that we do not use or create one of those templates for ourselves, because of course our players cannot trade with themselves. So that's one little edge case that we do need to keep in mind, and you may not have thought of until you make the mistake in game and you actually realize it yourself. Anyways, let's get into creating this function. So we're going to say local function, and this function is going to be called add player. And for the parameter, it's going to accept a player. Now inside of here, we're going to want to go ahead and clone the template. So we're going to say local clone equals container dot template, and then let's go ahead and clone it. After that, let's go ahead and parent it to the container. Let's also make sure that we can see it. So we'll set the visibility to true. Then let's update the name of it. And we're actually going to set that to the player's user ID. Now that we've updated the name of the actual button, we also want to display the player's name. So we have to update the player text label inside of the clone. So we're going to say clone.player, and then we'll update the text of this, and we'll actually just set that to the player's name rather than their user ID. In addition to the player text label, we also have the action text label, which by default, we do not want that to be displayed, as we only want the action text label to actually be displayed whenever we send a trade request to another player. Now, one of the last things that we need to do is set up what happens when we click on this button. So we're going to say clone.mouse button one click, connect that to an anonymous function. And what are we going to do inside of here? Well, we're going to use one of our remote events, which is going to be called send request, because we want to send a request to this player whenever we click on this button. So we'll call fire server on this, and then we'll go ahead and pass through the player's user ID over to the server to tell it, hey, we want to trade with this player. Now that we've created the add player function, we of course want to go ahead and use it. Now, in order to make this code as clean as possible, we're going to go ahead and actually create a function for doing this. This function is going to be called generate list. And inside of this function, what we want to do is loop through all of the players that are currently inside of our game and call the add player function for them. So we're going to say for underscore comma player in players, get players, do. Now remember the edge case that I pointed out earlier? We want to make sure that we don't accidentally display our own name inside of our own container. So if the player is equal to our local player, then we're just going to go ahead and continue through the loop. But if the player in this iteration is not us, then we're going to go ahead and call add player and simply pass through the player. Now that we've created that function, let's go ahead and call it. And we're actually just going to go ahead and call it right below where we created it because we want this function to be called as soon as the player joins the game. Now that's actually not the only time that we want to call the add player function. In addition to calling it when the player first joins the game, we also need to add players to it whenever a new player joins the game. So we're going to say players, and we're going to listen to the player added event. So we're going to say connect, and we're simply just going to connect that to the add player function. So now what we know is that when we first join the game, we're going to use one of the templates for every single player that's currently in the game. In addition to that, if any new players join the game, we're also going to generate a template for them. But another thing that we need to make sure of is that when a player leaves our game, that we no longer want to display their template because the player cannot trade with them. So in order to do this, we're going to say players, and we're going to listen to the player removing event. This time we'll create an anonymous function inside of here, which is going to accept a player. And now what we actually want to do is delete that player's clone from the container so that this local player no longer sees it. So we're going to create a variable called clone, which is going to be equal to container find first child. Then we'll use the toString method because we want to look for the player's user ID inside of the container. Now, if we are able to find it, then that means that we did generate one for them. So we're going to go ahead and destroy it. And now that's all that we need to do. When a player joins our game, we'll add one. And when they leave the game, we'll go ahead and clean that up and remove it. Cool. So now that we're actually creating a frame for each of the players that we're able to trade with, let's think of what else would actually have an effect or force us to make a change with each of the individual templates. One of the things that comes to mind is when the player sends the trade request to another player. So whenever they send that request, we actually want to update the text of the action text label, and we also want to display it as well. So to do that, let's go ahead and create a brand new function, which is going to be called trade sent. And it's going to accept a user ID, which is going to be a number. Now, of course, the user ID that this function is going to receive is the user ID that the player has sent a trade request to. And the reason that we need the user ID is because we need to find that specific clone inside of our container. So let's go ahead and create a variable called clone. We'll use find first child on the container. Then we'll use toString and we'll pass through the user ID. Now, if we don't actually find any clones, then we're going to stop the function right there. But if we do find the clone, then inside of the clone, we have that action text label, which we do want to make visible so that the player can actually see it. In addition to making it visible, we're also going to update the text of it as well because we want it to say sent with an exclamation mark. Now, after we update and display the action, the next thing that we want to do is automatically hide it. So in order to do that, we're going to use task.delay. We're going to wait 15 seconds. And after those 15 seconds, we want to make sure that the clone exists because what if the player has left during this time? And if the clone still does exist, then we're going to go ahead and hide the action text label because the previous trade that we sent has expired and we no longer want to display that action. Now that we've created this function, where are we going to use it? Well, let's go down towards the bottom of our script and we're going to connect to our first remote event that we created, which is called send request. So whenever this remote event is fired from the server, what we're going to do is call the trade sent function to display that action label to the player, notifying them that they have successfully sent a trade request out to the specific player. So now that we've set updating the action text label and displaying to a player when they've successfully sent a trade request to another player, the next thing that we want to set up is the notification frame because we want to update a couple of things on there. For instance, to display which player has actually sent the request, and we also want to display it to the player as well. So let's go ahead and create a function called notify, which similar to the trade sent function is going to accept the user ID as a number. Now inside of this function, we want to actually get the player from their user ID. So of the player service, we're going to use the get player by user ID function, and we're going to pass through the user ID. Now, if we don't actually get any player, then we're going to stop the function right there. Now, we're going to create a variable called new text, which we're going to use to update the from text label inside of the notification frame. So the new text is going to say from and then a colon, and after the colon, we'll go ahead and display the player's name. So now that we've created that variable, let's go ahead and update the text of the from text label inside of the notification frame, and we're going to set that to new text. In addition to that, we want to make sure that the notification frame is visible as well, so we're going to set that to true. Now, another thing that we want to do inside of here is automatically stop displaying this after a couple of seconds in order to functionally make the trade request expire. We don't want trade requests to last forever, and instead, we're actually just going to make trade requests only last for 15 seconds. So again, we're going to use a task.delay. We'll wait 15 seconds, create an anonymous function inside of here. And after those 15 seconds, we no longer want the notification frame to be visible. So we're going to set that to false. The thing is, though, is that we actually have to account for an edge case inside of here. What if the player receives 2 trade requests from 2 different people, all within a couple of seconds of each other? The notify function will run for the first notification. Then after 15 seconds, the notification frame is going to be hidden. Now, when this function is called for the second time, that 15-second timer will already be ticking down. But with the second call, we're going to be using another task.delay. So in another 15 seconds, that will be hidden. But of course, our first task delay is going to finish before the second one. So that will prematurely make the notification frame no longer visible because the first notification ended even though the second notification is still active. Let me know in the comment section how I did with that explanation. I feel like that was really good, but I could also see that being extremely hard to understand. And if that is extremely hard to understand, just follow along. Between the exit variable and the notify function, we're going to create a variable outside of here, which is going to be called last received request. By default, we're just going to set that to 0. And we're going to update this function with the user ID of the last trade request that we received. So inside of the notify function, we're going to say last received request, and we're going to set that to the user ID. Then inside of our task.delay, what we're going to do is we're going to check if the last received request is equal to this user ID. And if it is, then we're going to go ahead and make the notification frame no longer visible. And now that's all that we have to do for creating this function. Now, when are we going to call this? Well, we want to hook up to the remote event called receive request. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this. Then we'll change this to the receive request remote event. And the function that we want to hook up to is called notify. So now that we started scripting the notification frame, what else do we have to script with that? Well, of course, we have to script when we click on both of the buttons if we want to accept or ignore the trade request. So in order to do this, let's go ahead and create a function, which is going to be called respond to notification. And we're going to have a parameter called accept, which is going to be a boolean. Now inside of here, what do we want to do if the player clicked on accept? Well, what we want to do is communicate that to the server. So we're going to use the respond to request remote event, call fire server on that. Then we want to pass through the user ID of the trade request that we're responding to. And since we're accepting it, we're also going to pass through true as well. Now, when we accept somebody's trade request, what are we actually going to do? Well, of course, we're actually going to display the trade frame to them. But in addition to that, we want to hide the list as well as the notification frames because now the 2 players are actually trading. So we're going to say notification frame.visible equals false. And we'll say list frame.visible equals false as well. Now, what do we want to do if the player actually clicks on ignore and denies the trade request? Well, again, we want to communicate to the server, but this time we're going to pass through false. And another thing that we want to do is set the notification frame's visibility to false as well. Now, I guess to actually make this a little bit cleaner, we can just move the notification frame's visibility outside of both if statements to clean that up a little bit. But anyways, now that we've created this function, when are we going to use it? Well, again, going down towards the bottom of our script, we want to listen to whenever the player clicks on the accept or ignore text button that's stored inside of the buttons frame inside of the notification frame. So we're going to say notification buttons .accept .mouse button one click, connect that to an anonymous function. Now, whenever this button is clicked on, we want to call the respond to notification function and pass through true because the player clicked on accept. Then we can go ahead, copy and paste that. Then we'll listen to the ignore button being clicked. And of course, we'll now pass through false to respond to notification function. Now, actually, going back to things that are going to cause us to make changes to some of the clones inside of our container, another thing that we need to look out for is when a player responds to our trade request. If they decline it, then we actually want to display that on the action text label. And we'll also display if they accept it as well, but realistically, the frame is not going to be visible if they do accept it, so that doesn't really matter, but we're still going to do it because it's simple enough to implement either way. Anyways, we'll go ahead and start this off by creating a function called receive response, which for the first parameter, we're going to accept the user ID, which is going to be a number, and the second parameter is going to be the actual response, so we'll call that accept, and it's going to be a boolean. Then we can literally just copy this code from the trade sent function because we want to get the clone of whoever actually responded to us. Now that we've gotten that, let's just literally go ahead and copy all of this. But now when we go ahead and update the text of the action text label, we want to check if accept is true. And if accept is true, then we're going to set the text to say accepted. Otherwise, it'll say decline. And again, the player most likely can't actually see accepted, but we'll still just do it anyway. Now, if the player denies the trade request, we actually want to hide this a little bit quicker. So we'll hide this after about 5 seconds. Now that we've created that function, let's think of when are we actually going to use it? Well, again, like I said, we're going to use this when another player responds to us sending them a trade request, which they either accepted or declined. So we're going to go all the way down. The remote that we're going to listen to is the respond to request remote event, and we're simply just going to go ahead and connect that to the receive response function. Now, we are almost finished on the client side. We only have a little bit more to go. Another aspect of the GUI that we have is the toggle trade request button, and we're going to go ahead and create a function for updating this button whenever the player clicks on it. So we're going to say local function update toggle button. And inside of here, the first thing we want to do is get the player state. So we're going to say local state equals state manager dot get data. Then we want to get the actual value of if they're accepting trade requests or not. So we're going to say local value equals dot receive trade requests. And then we're going to create a variable called text. Now this variable is actually going to be the text that the button is going to display if the player has it toggled on or off. So if the value is true, then that means that the player has it toggled on. So we're going to say trade requests colon on. Otherwise, and now we can actually just go ahead, copy and paste that, and then we'll say trade requests off because the player has toggled it off. Now that we've actually set the text, what we're then going to do is update the text of the title text label stored inside of the toggle button. So we're going to say request toggle button dot title dot text, and then we're going to set that to the text variable. In addition to that, we want to go ahead and update the background color of the button itself. If it's toggled on, then we want to make it a nice little green, but if it's toggled off, then we want to make it a red. So we're going to say request toggle button dot background color 3, and if the value is equal to true, then again we're going to go ahead and make that a green, and we're going to go with that nice little green right there. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and make it red because the player has it toggled off. And now, when is this going to be called? Well, again, going all the way down towards the bottom of our script, we want to actually listen for the toggle request remote event, and we're going to use task.delay. We're going to wait 0 seconds. Of course, we're just doing this because we want the state manager to update before we run this function. And then we'll call the update toggle button function. In addition to calling it when the value is actually updated by listening to this remote event, we also want to call it when the player first joins the game so that it's toggled to the correct mode that the player last saved it in. So we'll go ahead and call update toggle button. And now that we've actually set that function up, another thing that we need to do is actually listen for when we click on that button to communicate to the server that we want to toggle accepting them on or off. So we're going to use the request toggle button variable. We'll listen for it to be clicked, and whenever it's clicked, we're going to use the toggle request remote event. We'll go ahead and fire server, and that's all that we have to do to communicate to the server that we want to change the current value. Okay. Now, with all that being said, we have officially scripted this pretty much entirely on the client side. What I mean by pretty much is we're done with this script for this video, so we can go ahead and close out of it. And now, with that being said, it's time to start scripting this on the server side. So let's go ahead and create a brand new script, which we're going to rename to be called trade. Now, inside of the server script, we of course want to make a couple of variables for some services along with a couple of other things. So we're going to create a variable for the replicated storage, the server script service, and the player service. We'll also create a variable for the remotes, which again, we're going to set to the trade folder that's inside of the remote folder. Additionally, we want to require the player data manager, so we'll create a variable for that. Next, we want to create 2 variables. The first variable is going to be called pending requests, which is going to be equal to a blank table. Now let's go ahead and start creating the type for this variable to make it easier to understand. We'll go ahead and create the type called pending requests, which is going to be equal to a table. Now this table is going to have number indexes, and those numbers are actually going to be individuals' players' user ID. So we're going to use the player's user ID for the key, and the value is actually going to be set to a table. Now this inner table is actually going to be an array, and now this array is going to contain all of the player's user IDs that this specific player has sent a request to. So to annotate this, we're going to set the keys as numbers, and the value is also going to be a number as well. So now that we've created that type, let's go ahead and set the pending request variable to that type. And like I said, we're going to go ahead and create a second variable, which is going to be called active trades, which again is going to be set to a blank table. Now this variable is going to be used to actually track which players are trading with each other. And one of the many reasons that we need to know this is because if a player is already trading, then they should not be receiving any requests from other players who are trying to send them to that player. Now, let's go ahead and create the type for this as well. So we're going to say active trades, which is going to be a table. For the keys, we're going to be using numbers, which again is going to be the individual's player's user ID. And the value of each player's user ID is going to be a table. Now this table is going to have 3 properties. The first property is going to be called selected pets, which is going to be a table. Now this table is actually going to be an array. So for our keys, we're going to be using numbers. And for the value, we're going to be using strings. And these strings are more specifically going to be the pet's UUID. So each time a player selects a pet that they want to trade, we're going to add the UUID of that pet to this list. The next property of this table is going to be called isReady, which is going to be a Boolean. And we're going to set that if the player has readied up in the trade. And the third and final property is going to be target ID, which is going to be a number, as that's going to be the other player who is a part of this trade's user ID. So now that we've created that type, let's go ahead and set the variable's type just like that. Okay, so now that we have both those variables created, first things first, when the script first starts up, we want to add all the players which are currently in our game to the pending request table. So we want to add their user ID as a key and then just set the value of it to a blank table. We also want to do this whenever the player joins the game as well. So first things first, we're going to loop through all the players inside of players get players. And like I said, we're going to add the player's user ID to this table, and we're just going to set that to a blank table. And again, we want to do this whenever a player joins our game. So we're going to listen to the player added event, and whenever the player joins our game, we are going to set the user ID as the key and the table as the value. Now, along with doing that, we also want to clean this table up, so whenever the player leaves our game, we also want to remove them from this table. So let's just go ahead and actually copy and paste this. This time though, we'll listen to the player removing event, and now rather than setting that to a blank table, we're going to set that to nil. Cool, and now that we've started using the pending request table, the first thing that we're going to do is create a function called send request. This is going to accept the player who is sending the request and the user ID of who they want to send that request to. First things first, we want to go ahead and actually get the target player from their user ID. So we're going to say local target player equals players get player by user ID, pass through the user ID, and if we're not able to get a player from that ID, then we're going to stop the function right there. After that, we need to get that target player's profile. So we're going to create a variable called target profile, and we're going to use the player data manager. Inside of there, we have the profiles variable, and then we're going to index that with the target player. Now, if we do not get the target profile, then we'll stop the function right there. And now that we have their profile, we can check if they are accepting trade requests. So we're going to create a variable called isTargetAcceptingRequests, and we're going to set that equal to the target profile .data.receive trade requests. And now if they are not accepting requests, then we want to stop the function right there and not send them a trade request. Now, after we know that they are accepting trade requests, the next thing that we need to check is if this player has already sent a trade request to that player, because we don't want to spam that player with requests if there's already a request pending. So we're going to create a variable called pending requests. Inside of the pending request table, we're going to look for the player's user ID, and as long as we get it, which we should always get it, we can create a variable to check if the player has already sent the request. And how do we check if the player has already sent a request to this user ID? Well, we'll use table.find and look inside of the pending request table for the target's user ID. And now, if the player has already sent a request to this player and it's still pending, then we're going to stop the function right there. But now, if we know that this player is not on cooldown, then what we want to check is if the other player that this player is sending the request to has sent this player a request. Because if the other player has sent this player a request and this player is sending that player a request, then we should just treat that as either of them hitting the accept button and automatically put them right into a trade. So we're going to create a variable called target requests. We're going to index the pending request variable with the target user ID, and we want to make sure that we do get that. And if we do get that, then we want to check if the target has already sent a request. And we're going to do that by using table.find on the target request table and look for the player's user ID who is trying to send this request. And now if this is true, then we just want to go ahead and start the trade. So we'll just leave a comment right there. And we also want to call return because we're going to stop the function right there as well. But now if we get all the way down to the end of this function, then that means that we actually want to send the trade request to the target user ID. So we're going to use the send request remote event. We'll go ahead and fire client, and then we're going to fire this to the player who actually triggered this function to run. And we'll pass back the user ID that the player successfully has sent a trade request to. Then we'll use the receive request remote event, and we'll fire that to the target player, and we'll pass through the player's user ID who is sending them the request. So now that we've sent those requests, we also have to put the player on cooldown so that they're not able to spam this player with requests. So we're going to use table.insert on the pending request table, and we'll go ahead and insert the player's user ID. And what we're doing here is putting them on a cooldown. So since we're putting them on a cooldown, we need to make sure that we take them off that cooldown. So we're going to use task.delay. We'll wait 15 seconds. Then we'll create a variable called index because we want to use table.find on the pending request table to make sure that the user ID is still inside of there. And as long as it's still inside of there, then we're going to go ahead and remove the cooldown. So we'll remove that user ID from the pending request table. Now we're almost finished with this function, but there's one more thing that we want to do. Another thing that we want to consider is if the player is sending a trade request to another player who is currently trading. We don't want to let that trade request go through because the player is already busy trading with another player. Now let's go ahead and actually create a function called isPlayerTrading, which is going to accept a player. Now inside of this function, all we're going to do is return active trades and index that with the given player's user ID, and we're going to return if that does not equal nil. So if that does not equal nil, then that means that this player is actively trading. So now that we've created that function, let's go ahead and use it inside of the send request function. And after we check if the target is accepting requests or not, that's where we'll check if the target is trading. So we'll create a variable called isTargetTrading, and that's going to be equal to the isPlayerTrading function. and we'll pass through the player. So of course, if the target is trading, then we want to go ahead and stop the function right there. Cool. So now that we've actually set up sending trade requests, the next thing we want to do is create a function for handling when a player responds to a trade request. So we're going to create a local function, which is going to be called respond to request. This is going to accept a player, a user ID, which of course is a number, and the response, which we'll call accept, and that's going to be a boolean. Now we kind of want to do the same thing that we already did inside of send request, so we want to get the target player. Now the next thing that we want to do is get the target's requests. So we're going to create a variable called target requests, and inside of the pending request table, we want to look for the player's user ID. And if we do get the target requests, then we want to check if the target has even sent the request or not. So we'll create a variable called hasTargetSentRequest, which is equal to table.find. We're going to look through the target request table for the player's user ID who is responding to this request. So we want to make sure that this request was even sent to this original player, because we don't want a player to be able to force themselves to trade with another player by responding to a request that they were never actually sent. So now if the target has not sent a request to this player, then we want to actually stop the function right there. And I actually kind of set this if statement up a little bit poorly. So what we're actually going to say is if not target request, then we'll stop the function right there. So we want to make sure that we do get the target request, and then we'll verify that the target has actually sent a request to this player, because if not, we want to stop the function right here as well. So after going through all those steps, the next thing that we want to do is we want to check if the player has actually declined the request. And if the request is being declined, then what we want to do is remove this player's user ID who is responding from the target's sent pending requests. So we're going to say table.remove, and from the target request table, we're going to remove hasTargetSentRequest. And now the reason that we're removing this is because table.find will actually return to us the index of where this user ID is being stored. And we need to use that index in table.remove. So since this player is declining that trade, we're removing them from the pending requests. And we also need to replicate this to the target player. So we're going to use the respond to request remote event. We'll call fire client. We're going to fire this to the target player. We'll pass through the user ID of the player who is responding, along with false because they've declined this trade. And we're going to use return so that we stop the function right there if the request is not accepted. But now, if the request is actually accepted, then one of the last things that we need to check is if the target is already trading. And we can do that by using the isPlayerTrading function and pass through the target player. Because if the player is already in the middle of a trade, we don't want to just pull the player out of that trade and start a brand new one. We want both players to not be trading at all in order to begin a trade. Anyways, if we get this far down, then we know that we want to actually go ahead and start trading. So we'll just leave a comment right here. Now, when are we going to actually use this function? Well, let's go down towards the bottom of our scripts. And now I actually just realized that I forgot to hook up the send request function as well, but that's fine. We'll do both of these. So for send request, we're just simply going to hook that up to the send request remote event. So we'll say on server event, connect, and then we'll call the send request function whenever this remote event is fired. And for the respond to request function, we'll just use that remote event. So we'll say remotes.respond to request.on server event, connect, and then we'll use the respond to request function. Now, one more remote event that we are going to have to hook up to is the toggle request remote event, which we haven't actually created a function for yet, but let's just type in here toggle trade request, and now we'll go ahead and create this function. So now below our active trades and above our isPlayerTrading function, we'll create a new function which is called toggle trade requests. This is simply just going to accept a player, and when this is called, we want to get the player's profile. Now, if we're not able to get their profile, then we'll stop the function right there. But if we do get the player's profile, then what we want to do is get the current value of what their received trade request is sent to. So we'll say profile.data.received-trade-requests, and then we'll go ahead and update the value. So we'll actually just go ahead, copy and paste this, and we'll say not current value to toggle it to the opposite value. Then let's go ahead and replicate this to the client by using the toggle request remote event. So we'll say fire client, we'll pass through the player, and then we'll pass through the not current value, so the opposite of what it currently is. And now, since we've created this function, we've also already hooked it up to the remote event that we would have had it connected to. So now that's all good to go. Now, below the isTrading function, we are going to create one final function, which is going to be called start trade. The parameters of this are going to be player 1, which is going to be a player, and player 2, which is also going to be a player. Now, inside of here, we're just going to go ahead and print starting trade between then the first player's name, then the word and then the second player's name. Now, in addition to printing that, let's go ahead and add these players to the active trades table so that we understand how we actually plan on using this table. So we will index this table with player 1's user ID, and we'll set that equal to a table. Now, this table has a couple of properties. We have the selected pets property, which we'll set to a blank table. It also has the isReady property, which we will set to false. and it'll also have the target property, which we will set to player 2's user ID. And now that we've added the first player to the active trades table, let's also add the second player as well. So let's just go ahead, copy and paste that, update what we're indexing the active trades table with. So we'll say player 2 instead of player 1. And then for the target ID, we are going to say player 1's user ID instead of player 2's. And now that we've added them to the active trades table, let's also use a remote event to replicate to the clients and let them know that they should start trading. So we'll say remotes.start. We'll call fire client on this. We'll first fire it off for player 1 and we'll pass through player 2's user ID. Then we can go ahead, copy and paste this. This time we'll fire it to the second player and pass through the first player's user ID, just like that. And now that we've created this function, we'll actually use it right here where we left the comment for start trade. So we'll say player and we'll pass through the target player as well. Then we'll go ahead and copy this. And inside of the send request function, we'll also replace this comment with this function call as well. And now that's actually all that we're going to do inside of this script for this video. So let's go ahead and test this out. In order to test this out, we're going to go to the test tab. We want to look at client and servers, make sure that we have this set on at least 2 players, and then click this start button right here. This will create the server and also launch 2 clients at the same time, which will allow us to emulate playing as 2 separate players, and then we can try trading with each other. So we can see both clients on the screen right now. Let's go ahead and click the trade button. When we click the trade button, we can see the GUI pops up. We can still see the monster dev, which is the default template because we have not made that not visible yet. But we can also see player 2 as well. And keep in mind, we are player 1. And now if we look from player 2's perspective, let's click the trade button and we can see player 1. Let's first go ahead and toggle trading on and off. And we can see that that is actually working. So that's cool. We'll go ahead and toggle trade requests off on player 1. And now from player 2, let's go ahead and try to send player 1 a trade request. And when we try to send them a trade request, nothing's happening because they have it turned off. But now let's go to player 1's perspective and send a trade request to player 2. And now when we send a trade request to player 2, we can see the action text label is displayed and it displays sent. And we can also see the notification over here as well. Let's go ahead and hit ignore. And when we hit ignore, we can see that the action text label is updated with the client. So we can see that that's pretty much all functioning correctly. Now let's go ahead and send player 2 another trade request. This time we'll go ahead and accept it. And once we accept it, we can see that player 2's list frame is hidden, but player 1's isn't. So this is almost all functioning perfectly, but there's about 2 more things that we have to do real quick. The first thing I want to do is make that template no longer visible by default. So inside of the trade GUI, we have the list frame. Inside of the list frame, we have the container scrolling frame, and then we have the template text button. Let's go ahead and set that to not visible, and now that's all good to go. The other thing that we have to do is update how we scripted this on the client side. So inside of the start player scripts, GUI folder, trade folder, open up the list script, and what we want to do is go to the receive response function. And now if the response is that the player has accepted the trade request, then we want to set the list frame visibility to false because we no longer want that frame to be displayed. And we'll also do this for the notification frame as well. Now, with all that being said, we have a working trade list system. In the next episode, we'll actually be creating the entire trade system where the players can select pets and then actually trade them with another player. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you smash the like button. Feel free to go down below in the description and check out my Patreon if you want to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video.